Hey y'all, Biohack here. Today's going to be a bit of a different video, the primary purpose of which is to let you know that I'm starting a new channel to put my Raid Shadow Legends videos on, for those of you who might be interested, and I also wanted to use this to serve as a discussion for my thoughts about the game, what I think its strengths and its weaknesses are, and to tell future viewers of that channel a little bit about how I approach the game and what sort of content I'm interested in. So I realize this is a little different than the normal Black Desert enhancing content I do, but I just wanted to make an announcement because I know there are some of you in the community who are interested in Raid, and for those of you who are not, maybe you'll find something interesting here, or maybe not, and you'll leave. Whatever suits your interest. But first, let's go ahead and jump into it. So one of the first things I wanted to point out and disclose is that while this particular video is not sponsored in any way, and I'm totally able to speak freely about the game, I have been sponsored by the developers, Plarium, many times in the past, and I may do sponsorships with them in the future. So just keep that in mind. Like I said, I can talk freely about the game, and I'm going to give you my honest feedback on how I feel about it, but just know that there may be some potential bias there. And then also, if you want to check out the game, I will keep an active link to any potentially sponsored links I have down in the description. Like I said, not currently being sponsored by them, but if I am in the future, I'll put that in there. And then if you want to check out the game and you'd use that link, I would really appreciate it because it helped me out a bunch. With that aside, let's talk about the game. What it is, what it isn't, and, kind of what it gets right and what it gets wrong. The first thing I think we should talk about is kind of the elephant in the room, and that is the game's very heavy marketing. If you've been anywhere on the internet, you've probably seen ads for Raid. They're everywhere, and they sponsor a ton of different content creators. And I have mixed feelings about these ads. Some of them are fine and just sort of comedy skits. Sometimes they advertise the game in a way at which I don't feel really captures what the game is really about. For example, they'll say things like, it's a story-based RPG. And it's like, is it? There's not really a story that anyone cares about, and there's not really a lot of role-playing. So, some of that's a little loose, which I think is kind of a shame, because what I think the game does well is really interesting and has a lot to offer, and there's tons of people that play this game and really like this game. But like I said, if you go in expecting a story-based RPG, you're probably going to be disappointed. So let's first talk about what the game actually is and how I like to play it. What instead I think Raid excels at is being a fantastic sort of second monitor idle game grinder with a fun side of like team building and hero collecting. The idle grinder side of the game is really nice because I feel like the game requires just enough user input to be interesting, but not so much as that it will heavily distract from what you're doing on your main computer. Whether for me that's usually like playing BDO or working from home. In fact, you'll notice in a lot of my BDO videos, you'll see a little window up in the corner, which is my second monitor where Raid is being played. And it's really nice. It just kind of, you give it enough input to keep it chugging along while not slowing down my enhancing or any of the other stuff I'm doing. And then given the way the mechanics of the game work with its like variable stat gear and how you have to build out all these different champions, you kind of always have these like little things you're working towards and little items that you want to acquire. And so as you're kind of treating it as an idle game grinding on the side, you're constantly getting these like little dopamine hits of all the like cool stuff you could get. And because there's a lot of RNG involved in getting the gear on multiple layers, you'll get like a thing, you'll be like, oh, this could potentially be really good. And you'll get excited about that. And then later you'll go on and roll it up, and probably you'll end up crap, but sometimes it'll end up a piece that's really good. And so you get that kind of like constant engagement, little exciting moments that kind of just keep it interesting. But at the same time, like I said, it doesn't take away from the main thing that you're working on. And I think it's important to recognize that Raid is best enjoyed in this style as like a second monitor style type game. I see a lot of people, especially people who are looking to make kind of like angry videos about the game, that just like download it and play it and quickly become really bored as they just like sit there and watch the gameplay itself, especially in the like really early easy starter areas. And yeah, if that's how you're going to approach the game, it's super boring. I mean, I wouldn't play it like that. Like just sitting there watching the game just play itself is not an enjoyable experience. But that's not the only way to engage with the game. And like I said, I think it's a lot more fun if you treat it kind of like you would, say, RuneScape, for example, back in the day, where you're like watching Netflix and it's just grinding away on the other monitor. You know, it's that kind of game, that kind of side game, not the main thing that you're focused on. And so from that aspect, it's like I said, because of the variable stat gear, because you kind of need all this different stuff and you're constantly like working on all these different things, it fits in really well as that kind of like side, low effort but highly enjoyable side content. So that's how I think you should approach the game if you want to have the best experience with it. So where do you actually invest your time while playing Raid? Obviously, you don't just download the game and click a button and then that's it. You never touch it again. You still have to engage with the game in a lot of different ways. And where that comes into play mostly is in the team building strategy aspects of the game. So Raid has something like 600 different champions with a ton of unique and interesting abilities. And this creates a huge amount of variety and an insane number of ways to build different teams to conquer the game's different types of content. So, for example, a lot of the game's mechanics also create this like desire to make these super fine-tuned teams. So you have, for example, the game's turn meter mechanics, where champion's turn is based on the speed stat that is one of the stats on the gear. And then you end up in this situation where you have to speed tune your champions in a very particular way against a particular piece of content so that they're all going in the right order. For example, you want your champion that buffs your nuker's damage to go before the nuker goes. You want champions that decrease the enemy's defense to also go before that champion. And that's just the very, very surface level. It gets a lot more complex than that. One of the perfect examples of this sort of interesting team-based mechanic is in the clan boss. So I run a team called the Bat Eater composition, which is one of the most popular unkillable compositions in the game. And what it does is, by utilizing a couple of champions which give your team an unkillable buff on a fairly long cooldown, combined with other champions that reduce that cooldown, and then tuning them in a very particular way so that those team members are always going right before the enemy attacks you, and they're putting up that unkillable buff right before the enemy attacks you, you can essentially stay unkillable until the boss ultimately has the ability to surpass that unkillable buff and go for, you know, a really long time, get the most possible damage you can on the boss, and therefore get the best loot. And so that's the kind of like interesting strategy that comes in here, and it requires a lot of very precise tuning and tweaking and optimization to get it just right. And all of that tuning that's necessary, all of that optimization that's necessary, also feeds back into the whole trying to set different goals, like, oh, I need this particular piece of gear to help get enough speed to make that tune work. That kind of thing creates this demand for that variable stat gear that I talked about, that then when you're grinding, you get super hyped when you get, because you unlock all these new potentials, and you can imagine these new potentials that you want to work on, and then slowly accumulate the champions and the gear that you need to actually do it. And then when it finally all clicks together, you know, it just creates a really satisfying experience, and like that you know, yes, finally victory feeling you get from overcoming a difficult challenge. And so that's what I think the sort of active involvement in the game really does best. And then once you have those teams in place, you kind of just run them sort of, like I said, on the side monitor to get the rewards. And then really it's about either building teams for PvP or waiting for new content that the game releases pretty regularly these days to create kind of sort of a new puzzle that you have to solve with these team compositions. So that's what I think the game does really well, is those interesting team building mechanics. So those are two of the things that the game does well. Some of the things that the game doesn't do so well, or some of the game's cons, are obviously the biggest one that everyone, you know, comes to everyone's mind, which is pay to win. Is the game pay to win? And, you know, how problematic is that? And the truth is, yes, it's a very pay to win, predatory mobile game. There's no getting around that. I'm not going to deny it. I'm like, anyone who tells you it's not is lying to themselves. Like, absolutely, it's a pay to win, predatory mobile game. That said, there is a difference between a game being pay to win and being free to play friendly. A game can be very pay to win and offer the ability to buy a lot of power with real money, while also creating a fun and enjoyable experience for people who are either completely free to play or low spend. I would consider myself a relatively low spender. I mostly just buy the like $10 a month gem pack and maybe the Forge Pass for like $20 every other month or so, and then maybe some energy packs here or there. Relatively low spend, and I've completed basically all of the game's content except for like the very newest stuff on the hardest difficulties. And I know there are players like Earbad is, for example, a YouTuber that's completely free to play that completes all the game's hardest content. So it'll take you longer, but you can do it as a free to play player. And in fact, I think because the game is all about like solving these challenges and overcoming these different puzzles with your champions, I think honestly you can actually have a better experience as a free-to-play player than as someone spending a lot of money. Because if you just pay to skip the challenge, you don't really get that satisfaction of like working on it for a long time and eventually creating the perfect composition to actually beat it and being excited about it. If you just drop a bunch of cash and beat it easily, then you don't really get that. So I think you could actually have even a more enjoyable experience as a free-to-play player. The main issue where pay-to-win comes into place is in the game's PvP. But the reality is that the game is not really that much of a PvP game. Very early on, well, first off, we should say that the game's PvP is not direct player versus player. Basically, each player sets their defense, and another player will attack their defense, but the AI is playing the other player's defense, the computer, and you're playing the offense. And so the result of that is that it's way easier to win on offense than it is on defense, and so you're going to win the vast majority of your PvP battles. And early on, PvP can be a bit of a challenge, and then once you reach the mid-game, it just becomes a joke where you just auto-farm it, no problem. You beat every team you fight, and you intentionally put a bad team on your own defense so that people are knocking you down, because you fight people who are more equal level to you in ranking. And once you're at, a certain bracket, you get the best rewards you can, and there's really not much reason to push higher than that. So you end up just in a situation where the PvP is just a joke. And it's fine. It's easy. It doesn't really matter. And so therefore the pay to win doesn't really matter. Like if I'm fighting easy teams, I'm like, what other people spend in the game has no bearing on me whatsoever. That doesn't really come back into play unless you're trying to push for Platinum Arena, which is like the top of the top arena, which, happens a couple times a week. And like not that many people actually engage with that content. I don't. It's not important. You don't really get very good rewards for it. It's not a big deal. It's mostly bragging rights, and it's mostly a whale off. Just skip it. Who cares? It doesn't matter. And if that's the attitude you take towards the game, then sure, it's a predatory mobile pay-to-win game, but who cares? Like, it doesn't affect me in any way. I'll spend, whatever I feel like spending on it, whether that's a little bit or nothing at all, and I'll just do the content as it comes out, and, that's great. There's no real reason to play it any other way. So, yes, it's pay-to-win, but that pay-to-win only really matters if you want to be, like, the top PvPer in the world. And if you don't care about that, then it doesn't matter. All right, the last thing I want to talk about is the community. While playing the game itself largely feels like a solo experience, even when you're doing PvP, like I said, you're fighting against an AI, essentially. So it's not exactly like a social experience while you're playing the game. That being said, the game does have a really strong community with a lot of active content creators on YouTube and a lot of active clans to become involved with. And because the game really comes down to a puzzle strategy game, there's a strong incentive for people to kind of openly discuss and theory craft different compositions, different ways to beat the content, whether that's making YouTube videos or Reddit posts or discussing it in Discord channels with your guild. There's always this kind of like back and forth and discussion about like which champions should I rank up, which compositions should I try and run. And so there is really a lot of engagement in the community and a lot of discussion and people talking with each other, which is really good. Like I said, there are a ton of active YouTubers, especially for Raid, although streamers as well. And actually, because the BDO booth was right next to the Raid booth at TwitchCon 2022, I actually had the opportunity to meet a number of these people IRL, including, I think I met Chosen, Layla Fox, Darth Microtransaction, and Deadwood Jedi, and I found them to be all really nice, genuine people. So yeah, there's a ton of people out there. There's a thriving community, ton of YouTube content. Like I said, I probably watch more Raid Shadow Legends YouTube content than anything else. So, if you want to get engaged in that, I think it's really strong. There's a lot of large active player base. the game is one of the most popular mobile games in the world, and I know it's a lot of advertising, but it's not just advertising. There actually is a community there and is a good game behind it that a lot of people enjoy. Okay, to summarize everything up, I believe Raid can be an enjoyable game, especially when it's played as a second side monitor game. It has a lot of champions with unique mechanics which create a huge amount of creative ways to build teams and tackle the different content. The game is pay to win, but it's still enjoyable as a free-to-play and a low-spend player. And the game has a very active community that are helpful and friendly, and a lot of interaction to figure out all the different puzzles in the game. I would say if you struggle with spending in freemium games, Raid may definitely be one to avoid. But otherwise, if you're looking for something to play on your phone or your other monitor while you're working or playing another game, Raid can be a great option to fill that niche. Like I said, I'm not currently being sponsored, so this is just my honest thoughts on the game. But I do sponsorships with them periodically, so I'll be sure to include a link in the description if you want to check out the game. Help me out and use that. But otherwise, I wish you the best. Happy gaming. Cheers.